Dawn crept lazily through the curtains, hesitant to announce the arrival of a new day. The dim light stretched cautiously across the room, casting soft shadows against the walls. But Daniel had been awake for hours. He no longer remembered the last time he had slept without interruption. Lying on his side, he felt the cold seep into one half of his body, a silent reminder that his presence there was more an accident than a choice. Beside him, Julia slept deeply, her breathing slow and even. Her face, illuminated by the faint morning glow, was as serene as ever, untouched by the storm that had raged between them the night before. She always slept soundly after an argument. While he lay awake, replaying every word, every wound, she drifted into slumber as if the pain she inflicted simply evaporated into the air. The reason for last night's fight had been trivial, as always. Perhaps he had forgotten to bring home bread. Perhaps he had taken too long to respond to a message. The excuses changed, but the pattern remained the same. Julia's voice would rise, sharp and unwavering. A dry laugh would follow, laced with disdain. Then the final blow, her eyes locking onto his with the same exasperation she reserved for a clumsy child. God, Daniel, how can you be so useless? He had heard those words before. The first time, they had landed like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. But over time, he had come to expect them, his body bracing for impact before she even spoke. Once, he had tried to reason with her. "I'm sorry, I forgot," he had murmured, hoping to end the conversation quickly. "Of course you forgot. Like everything else." Her words came laced with irritation, as if his very existence was a burden. "I always have to be on top of you, because if I'm not, you just forget. You have responsibilities, Daniel. You're an adult. How is it even possible that someone like you managed to get a decent job?" Shame coiled around his throat, thick and suffocating. He had stared down at the table, willing himself to disappear. But Julia wasn't satisfied with silence. She needed to make her point perfectly clear. "It's not difficult, Daniel. Going to the dry cleaners doesn't require special skills. I'm not asking you to cure cancer, just to do one thing right. But of course, that's too much for you." She had shaken her head, crossing her arms with an exaggerated sigh, as if even looking at him was exhausting. He had wanted to defend himself. He wanted to tell her that he had been working late, that his mind was cluttered with 100 other things. But experience had taught him that any attempt at an explanation would only make things worse. His mistakes, no matter how insignificant, always ended with him feeling like a scolded child, forever needing to prove he was worthy of basic respect. One night, after another similar argument, he had mustered the courage to confront her. He had spoken carefully, his voice measured, his heart pounding. "Julia, do you realize how you talk to me sometimes? I feel like everything I do is wrong." She had blinked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment before amusement flickered across her face. "Are you seriously saying I treat you badly? Don't be so dramatic, Daniel. Now you're the victim?" She scoffed, shaking her head. "My God, what ridiculous sensitivity. Do I have to talk to you like a child so you don't get offended?" "No," he had said quietly. "I'd just like you to speak to me with a little more respect." She had laughed, a dry, humorless sound, and leaned against the doorway, her arms folded across her chest. "Respect?" she repeated, her voice thick with mockery. "For that, you'd first have to do something worthy of respect." That sentence had cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He had fallen silent, the words catching in his throat. Julia had left the room, unconcerned, while he remained there, staring at nothing, the weight of helplessness settling in his chest. Over time, he stopped arguing. He stopped correcting her when she exaggerated his faults in front of others. He stopped trying to prove that he wasn't the failure she believed him to be. And that, he realized later, was the worst mistake of all. It became clear when he noticed how effortlessly Julia transformed in the presence of others. In public, she was charming, witty, effortlessly engaging. She could discuss any topic with ease, her laughter light, her smile effortless. She would slip her hand into his in front of their friends, introduce him with pride, speak of him in affectionate tones. For a long time, he had clung to the hope that this version of Julia was real too. That somewhere beneath the sharp words and the scathing looks, she still loved him. But with time, he understood. Her sweetness wasn't for him. It was for the audience. He was not her partner in those moments. He was a prop, a necessary element in the image she had carefully constructed. One evening, at a gathering with friends, someone asked him about a major project at work. Just as he opened his mouth to answer, Julia laughed softly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Oh, don't put too much pressure on him," she said playfully. "He's not exactly the best at giving speeches." The group laughed with her, oblivious to the way Daniel's spine stiffened, the way his hands clenched under the table. It was never just a harmless joke. It was a quiet, deliberate way of making him feel small. A reminder that no matter where they were, she controlled the narrative. And just like always, he let it happen. Daniel reached for his glass, but before he could even begin to answer, Julia took a sip of her wine and smoothly spoke for him. "Oh, honey, that's not exactly it, but don't worry, it's a complicated topic." The laughter that followed was light-hearted, effortless. A shared joke among friends. But beneath her polished tone, the message was unmistakable. "You're not smart enough to talk about this." From that moment, Daniel began to see the pattern with startling clarity. At every gathering, every dinner with friends, every family event, Julia found ways to chip away at him. Her remarks were never outright cruel, never sharp enough for anyone else to recognize the true weight of them, but they landed precisely where they were meant to. "Daniel is terrible with directions. You have no idea how many times we've ended up lost because of him. If they gave him an award for forgetting things, he'd probably forget to pick it up too." Each comment was delivered with a playful smile, a casual shrug, as if it were nothing more than the harmless teasing between husband and wife. And always there was laughter, because she made it seem innocent. A joke. But to Daniel, it wasn't a joke. It was a slow unraveling of his dignity, thread by thread. The worst part wasn't the words themselves. It was that no one noticed. To the outside world, Julia was the charming, patient wife, and he was the absent-minded, forgetful husband who was lucky to have her. No one saw what he felt, the slow erosion of his self-worth, the way each remark left another invisible bruise. One evening, after yet another dinner filled with these quiet humiliations, he finally found the courage to ask her, "Why do you do that?" His voice was quiet but firm. "Why do you always have to make me look like a fool in front of everyone?" Julia arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a smirk. "Oh, Daniel, don't be so dramatic. They're just jokes. Or do you not have a sense of humor now either?" But they weren't jokes. They were daggers wrapped in silk, disguised as humor. And for the first time, Daniel realized just how deeply they had cut him. It wasn't just one fight that led him to his decision. It was years of small wounds, each one leaving no visible scar but bleeding him dry all the same. The breaking point came on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. There were no shouting matches, no slamming doors, no fists hitting tables. Just another comment. One of many. But this time, something inside him shifted. They were grocery shopping together, something they rarely did. As they moved through the aisles, Daniel stopped in front of the wine section, running his fingers over the bottles. "Maybe we could get one for dinner on Friday?" he suggested, not thinking much of it. Julia barely looked up from her phone. "Why? You don't know anything about wine. You'd probably pick the worst one." It was said without malice, without any particular emotion at all. A flat, automatic dismissal. A judgment so casual it was as if she were stating an indisputable fact. And yet, something in Daniel ignited. It wasn't about the wine. It wasn't even about the words themselves. It was about the exhaustion of living beneath the weight of her constant, quiet disdain. The realization that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, he would never be good enough in her eyes. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. And in that moment, he finally understood. Nothing would ever change. That night, instead of slipping into their usual routine, Daniel sat at his desk and opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before he finally typed the words. "Divorce attorneys near me." For a long time, he just stared at the screen. A part of him still wanted to believe it wasn't necessary. That maybe if they talked, if they tried, things could get better. But another part of him, the part that had been silent for far too long, knew the truth. He had already spent too many years waiting for a change that would never come. The next day, during his lunch break at the office, he made the call. "I want a divorce." The voice on the other end was calm, practiced, as if the words Daniel had struggled to say were ones they had heard countless times before. "Have you discussed this with her?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "No." He hesitated. "She won't take it well." There was a pause. Then, in a voice gentle but knowing, the lawyer asked, "Physical abuse?" "No," Daniel answered. Then, after a breath, emotional. The word felt foreign on his tongue. He had never said it out loud before. But it was the truth. The lawyer began explaining the process, his voice steady, methodical. But Daniel's mind was elsewhere, lost in every argument, every belittling remark, every moment that had chipped away at him until he had become someone he no longer recognized. That afternoon, when he left the office, he knew there was no turning back. For the first time in years, he was making a decision for himself. A decision that didn't seek her approval. A decision that wasn't dictated by how she would react. A decision that belonged to him alone. That evening, as he sat across from her at the kitchen table, he slid the divorce papers toward her. Julia stared at them, her fingers resting lightly against the edges as if they might burn her. For the first time, she looked unsettled. "You're making a mistake," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual, more restrained. She didn't sound angry. She sounded afraid. Daniel paused in the doorway, glancing back at her one last time. For years he had waited. Waited for a different tone. Waited for words that weren't laced with contempt. Waited for something, anything, to make him feel like he mattered. But now he understood. It didn't matter. It didn't matter if she tried to wound him one last time, or if she pretended to be blindsided, feigning innocence. She was no longer his problem. With a faint, almost wistful smile, free of bitterness, free of resentment, he met her gaze. Maybe. And then he walked out the door without looking back. The cold morning air hit his face as he stepped outside, crisp and sharp against his skin. But this time, he didn't shudder. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of her words pressing against his chest. With every step, the invisible chains he had carried for so long began to fall away. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead. But for the first time, he had something he had never had with her. The freedom to choose his own path.